In 1970, Cadillac put the largest engine ever fitted to an American passenger car into production. 500 cubic inches, 400 horsepower, and for the time, that number was real. 6 years later, that same engine, with the same bore, the same stroke, and the same displacement, was producing just 190 horsepower. Nothing about the engine itself had fundamentally changed. The rules around it had. They didn't ban the engine outright. Instead, they made it impossible to build it the way it was originally designed to work. The Cadillac was not alone. 11 other cars met a version of the same fate, not rejected by buyers and not outperformed by their competitors. So why did every one of them disappear the same way, quietly, without a headline, without anyone explaining what had actually happened? The answer is in the cars themselves. Each one left evidence behind. Car number 1, the 1970 Cadillac 500. 1970 was supposed to be a peak moment for the American luxury car. Cadillac had just bored its 472 cubic inch V8 out to 500 cubic inches, 8.2 liters of pure displacement. The directive from their engineers was beautifully simple. Build a motor that pulls a full-size car down the highway without ever seeming to try. Smooth, unstressed, effortless. They got exactly that. Then Washington had other ideas. The Clean Air Act mandated a 90% reduction in hydrocarbon and carbon monoxide emissions by 1975. That gave Cadillac's engineers almost no time and almost no good options. To keep the engine legal, they dropped the compression ratio, added exhaust gas recirculation, and retarded the ignition timing. Each change bought them a little compliance and cost them a lot of soul. By 1976, that same 500 cubic inch engine made only 190 net horsepower, a 52% reduction in less than 6 years, from the exact same bore, the same stroke, the same displacement. The evidence is still sitting in the metal. A 1971 cylinder head casting has a measurably larger combustion chamber than the 1970 version. Any machinist with a basic set of tools can confirm it. The regulation did not just change a number on a datasheet, it physically reshaped the parts. The 500 cubic inch engine was gone after 1976. What it represented, that philosophy of building without constraint, went with it. Car number 2, the Tomaso Pantera. In 1971, Ford did something almost nobody expected. They signed a deal with Tomaso, an Italian manufacturer building a genuine mid-engine exotic, and put that car inside Lincoln Mercury dealerships across America. The Pantera. A real Italian sports machine with a Ford 351 Cleveland V8 under the rear deck, available for around $10,000 through your local dealer. Nothing else from Europe was within reach of that price or that kind of accessibility. The Cleveland engine was chosen deliberately so that any Ford dealer could service it with standard parts. Practical, sensible, quietly brilliant. But the 1973 bumper mandate required 5-mile-per-hour front impact protection, and the Pantera's low nose was shaped entirely around the logic of its mid-engine layout. There was no space for heavy impact absorbers without rebuilding the entire front of the car. Ford and Tomaso looked at the cost of that work against their sales numbers and arrived at the only answer the math would allow. The American distribution agreement ended after 1974. Tomaso kept building the Pantera in Europe for 18 more years. The same car, the same Ford engine, the same basic design. It just could not meet one specific structural requirement on this side of the Atlantic. Car number 3, the Ferrari. 308 GTB. Ferrari's story from this period is quieter, but the numbers tell it clearly. The 308 GTB in European specification produced around 255 horsepower. The American version, choked by EPA and California emissions requirements, put out between 205 and 230 horsepower depending on the year. Car and Driver tested both versions back-to-back, and the gap is still in their archive, measured in actual seconds on an actual track. John Davis called it politely. The numbers were less diplomatic. The American buyer paid the same price. They got a slower car. The difference had nothing to do with parts availability or engineering choices. It was the regulation, documented in print, by journalists who knew exactly what they were looking at. Pull up any chart of American fleet horsepower from 1970 to 1980 and look at the shape of it. It is not a gradual decline. It is not a gentle slope downward. It is a cliff. The average output of a new American V8 dropped from around 320 horsepower in 1970 to somewhere near 140 by 1980. More than half the power, gone in a single decade. Just paper, just mandates with dates and provision numbers. Car number 4, the Pontiac Firebird. The Firebird is where that cliff had a name and a face. It was not a single clean blow that ended things, but a slow drain of soul and power that lasted 35 years. Across 4 generations, one of America's most capable performance machines turned into a shadow of its former self, losing its edge one model year at a time. To understand how the Firebird lost its way, you have to look back at 1969. That year, the Firebird 400 produced 330 gross horsepower from its 6.6-liter V8. This was not a marketing number. It was a real figure from a real engine that earned its reputation on the street. By 1977, that same 6.6-liter displacement was producing 200 gross horsepower, a 39% drop in 8 years. The Clean Air Act had already forced engineers to drop compression ratios and add exhaust gas recirculation, just as it had at Cadillac. But a second wave of pressure was already building. The Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975 introduced the Corporate Average Fuel Economy Standards, known as CAFE. Manufacturers were now required to hit a sales-weighted average across every car they sold, starting at 18 miles per gallon in 1978 and climbing to 27.5 by 1985. The effect on the Firebird was devastating. Every low-economy V8 that rolled off a GM lot pulled the entire fleet average down. Rather than protecting the Firebird as a low-volume specialist car, GM slashed V8 availability across their entire rear-wheel drive lineup to save the fleet average. The 400 cubic inch engine was killed off after 1979. There was one final moment of defiance before the door slammed shut. Pontiac built 943 Trans Am SD 455s during the 1973 and 74 model years. These Super Duty cars put down 290 net horsepower even as the world changed around them. Production ended not because the engine was bad, but because the looming CAFE requirements made high-displacement V8s a commercial liability GM was no longer willing to defend. The third-generation Firebird arrived in 1982 with a fuel-injected 5-liter that struggled to produce 190 horsepower. The technology was more sophisticated. The car was no longer a powerhouse. When the fourth generation arrived in 1993 with the LT1 and later the LS1, it felt like a genuine recovery. These cars produced between 275 and 325 horsepower. But the comeback happened too late. The buyers who grew up during those lean, underpowered years of the 80s had already formed their opinions. GM pulled the plug on the Firebird after 2002. The regulations did not kill it with a single strike. They drained the life out of it during the decades when its reputation mattered most. Car number 5, the Lancia Stratos. While Detroit was drowning in fuel economy math, the Europeans were facing a different kind of problem entirely: the cost of simply being allowed to stay. The mechanism of their exit was a brutal piece of arithmetic. Federalizing a vehicle for the American market costs roughly the same whether a company sells 500,000 cars or just 5,000. Crash testing, emissions certification, parts infrastructure, dealer training, these are fixed costs that do not care about your sales volume. Spread them across 500,000 units and they disappear. Spread them across 5,000 and they can consume every cent of profit the vehicle was supposed to make. For the Europeans who specialized in low-volume, high-engineering masterpieces, this math was a death sentence hidden inside a thick book of regulations. Lancia had been a fixture in the United States since the late 1950s. Then there was the Stratos, a car that won the World Rally Championship 3 years in a row starting in 1974. A purpose-built machine representing the absolute peak of what a road-going rally car could be. It was never officially sold in America in any real numbers. Lancia would have had to crash test and certify it for federal standards, and the 500 units they needed to build for racing homologation could not possibly cover those costs. By 1982, Fiat looked at the books and made a cold decision for the entire Lancia brand. The cost of keeping up with federal safety standards, combined with expensive warranty claims from the Beta's rust issues, meant Lancia was spending more on compliance than they were making in profit. They left the country not because their cars were poorly engineered, but because the economics had become an impossible mountain to climb. Car number 6, the Alfa Romeo Milano. Alfa Romeo tried to hold on longer, maintaining a continuous presence in the United States since 1961 with icons like the Spider and the GT Vi. But by the late 1980s, the pressure from the California Air Resources Board was becoming too much to handle. California represented a massive chunk of American sales, and Alfa needed expensive U.S.-specific engine tunes just to stay legal in that one state. The Milano was pulled from the market after 1989 because the cost of keeping it emissions legal could not be justified by the number of people buying it. The situation only got worse as Japanese competitors like Acura and Mazda began offering better reliability and similar performance for much less money. Every time a buyer chose an Integra over an Alfa, the per-unit cost of federal compliance for the remaining Alfas went up, creating a death spiral that only moved in one direction. When Alfa Romeo finally withdrew from the United States after 1995, they stayed away for 13 years. Their return in 2008 was not because the rules had gotten easier. It was because Fiat had purchased Chrysler and gained access to a massive dealer network and a shared cost base. The regulatory barrier never got lower. The partnership with an American giant finally made the math work again. Car number 7, the Lamborghini Countach. The Countach tells a different story from this era, though the regulatory scars are still visible on the car itself. A European specification Countach LP 400 produced about 375 horsepower from its V12. The American version, choked with catalysts and revised timing to meet EPA standards, produced around 330. 50 horsepower sacrificed to compliance. But the most famous change was far more visible than a power figure. To meet the 5-mile-per-hour impact standards, Lamborghini had to bolt large rubber bumpers onto the front and rear of the car. These were shapes the original designers never intended to exist. They appear in every period photograph of a U.S. specification Countach, forever altering the profile of one of the most striking cars ever built. The Countach survived because its exclusivity created a demand that transcended performance specs. But those rubber bumpers remain a permanent reminder of the era when the law began to dictate the shape of our dreams. Car number 8, the Mazda RX-7. Those rubber bumpers on the Countach were just the beginning. By the early 1990s, the real power had shifted from Washington to a single state board in California, and the geographical center of regulatory pressure had moved with it. California had always operated under its own unique authority. Because the Clean Air Act included a specific waiver provision, the California Air Resources Board could set emissions standards far stricter than federal EPA levels. By the late 90s, roughly a third of the entire American car market was following California's rules instead of Washington's. If a manufacturer could not meet those standards, they were not losing a small slice of the map. They were losing a third of the country. 3 Japanese performance icons found this out the hard way. Mazda's problem was the most technical of the group, and unfortunately, the most permanent. Mazda had built its entire performance identity around the Wankel rotary engine, but that design naturally produces more hydrocarbon emissions per unit of power than a standard piston engine. This was not a failure of engineering or something a better tune could fix. Picture the apex seal, a small triangular strip that rides the corners of the rotor as it spins inside the housing. Its job is to keep the combustion chambers separated, but as it scrapes across the housing surface, it allows a thin, constant film of unburned fuel to bleed into the exhaust. It happens on every rotation, at idle, and at full throttle. There is no mapping strategy or catalyst upgrade that eliminates it entirely, because the geometry that causes it is also the geometry that makes the engine work. As California tightened its hydrocarbon limits through the early 1990s, making the RX-7 compliant became structurally more expensive than it was for any piston-driven competitor. Mazda eventually withdrew the RX-7 from the North American market after the 1995 model year. The rotary's emissions were the one thing that could not be engineered away. We saw this again when the RX-8 hit the same regulatory wall in 2011. Car number 9, the Toyota Supra. The Supra's situation was less about engine architecture and more about a cold business calculation. By 1997, Supra sales in North America had dropped to about 1,500 units a year. Recertifying the 2JZ GTE engine for continued sale would have meant new engine management software, updated catalytic converters, and revised evaporative emission controls for 1,500 cars. Toyota looked at that cost, compared it to the high-volume models they were already recertifying, and the Supra did not make the cut. Publicly, Toyota talked about exchange rates and declining interest. But the paper trail in the automotive press at the time named California's standards as a primary factor. The Japanese manufacturers had already agreed among themselves to cap their performance cars at 276 horsepower, a number chosen for insurance and regulatory optics back home. The Supra was pushing against that ceiling from both sides of the Pacific simultaneously. The pattern of which cars Toyota chose to save and which they let go shows exactly where they drew the line for profitability. Even after the American door closed, the Supra lived on in Japan until 2002, 4 more years of production in its home market. Car number 10, the Nissan 300ZX. The 300ZX reached its end through a combination of factors that made the math work against it with almost elegant cruelty. When the twin-turbo version launched in 1990, it cost around $27,000. By 1996, the rising yen had pushed that price to nearly $39,000. The car had not changed. The currency had. And if you have ever tried to change the rear spark plugs on a Z32, you already know that Nissan's engineers packed that engine bay so tightly that a routine service call required removing half the intake system. Adding California emissions hardware to a space that was already an engineering puzzle left dealers with a job that could take the better part of an afternoon just to reach the components that needed certifying. At the same time, the cost of meeting California's emissions rules was climbing, and the sales volume needed to pay for those updates was shrinking because the new price tag was so difficult to justify. Compliance costs going up, sales volume going down. Nissan pulled the 300ZX from North American showrooms after 1996. California had not banned any of these cars. They had simply made the math stop working. 276 horsepower, it turned out, was not a ceiling. It was a countdown. Car number 11, the Dodge Viper. 2 cars remained, and their stories deserve to be told separately because the same regulatory era produced 2 completely different responses. One fought for 14 years. The other looked at a single redesign quote and walked away in an afternoon. The Viper arrived in 1992 without a single airbag, and that was not an accidental oversight. It was a philosophical position. The engineers who created it had a specific vision of a driver's car that was unmediated and raw, a machine that challenged the person behind the wheel. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety, Standard 208, was moving toward requiring airbags in every passenger car sold in the country, but Chrysler decided to fight rather than give in. If you look through the public records, you can find Chrysler's exemption applications, a documented, deliberate struggle spanning over a decade to keep the Viper's original soul intact. The fact that the car went 14 years without airbags was not a mistake or a lucky break. It was the result of constant negotiation with the government. That argument finally ran out for the 2006 model year. The engineers were forced to build the systems into the steering wheel, the dash, and the door panels. The cockpit had to change to fit the new hardware. A larger steering wheel, thicker door panels, a shifted interior geometry. The Viper survived, but it became a different object than the one the engineers had originally intended to build. Car number 12, the Land Rover Defender. The Defender did not survive the transition. The Defender's American journey ended in 1997 for a reason that was almost purely geometrical. The vehicle's old-fashioned ladder frame with a separate steel body had no proper place to mount airbag modules or create the necessary deployment paths. Making the car compliant would have required a total redesign of the body structure, not a simple update. Land Rover looked at the price of that redesign against the 2,000 or 3,000 units they were selling in America each year and made the only logical financial choice. At the moment Land Rover left the American market, the Defender was still being sold in over 140 countries around the world. There was plenty of global demand. The engineering was not obsolete. One specific standard in one specific country required a change that the local sales volume could not pay for. The car itself was not finished. The American chapter of its history was. Think about the contrast between these last two cars for a moment. The same regulatory era, the same federal mandate, two completely different responses. If Land Rover had sent the Viper team's lawyers into those compliance meetings, the Defender might have stayed on American roads until the new millennium. And if Chrysler had run the Defender's cost-benefit numbers on the Viper, that car might have died quietly in 1998 without anyone filing a single exemption. What saved one and ended the other was not the engineering. It was the will to fight and the accounting that either justified or killed that fight. 46 years, 12 cars, 3 distinct waves of regulation that moved through the North American market like a rising tide, each one reaching further than the one before it. The first wave began in 1970 and lasted through 1976. The Clean Air Act took aim at the massive displacement of American engines, and the Cadillac 500 became its most visible casualty. The Pantera and the Ferrari 308 were caught in the same shift through different means, bumper mandates and emissions detuning. The essential character of this first wave was domestic, defined by American engines and mandates that forced manufacturers to absorb the costs from the inside. The second wave arrived in the late 1970s and stretched into the mid-80s. Cafe fleet averages squeezed rear-wheel drive performance cars until there was nowhere left to go. The cost of federal safety certification began pushing out European brands. Lancia left entirely in 1982. The Firebird was drained year after year. The Countach survived only because its extreme exclusivity allowed it to carry the weight of rubber bumpers and reduced power. The third wave started in the early 1990s and did not let up until 2016. California became the deciding factor for a third of the country. The rotary geometry of the RX-7 could not stay under the hydrocarbon limit. The Supra's recertification math stopped working. The 300ZX faced compliance costs and currency shifts simultaneously. The Viper fought for 14 years before finally giving in. The Defender looked at the redesign cost and walked away from a market it would not see again for decades. The Firebird is the thread that connects all three phases. It is the only nameplate present for the entire span, surviving the early detuning of the 70s, the fuel economy pressures that followed, and the California era that finished off its Japanese contemporaries. If you look at its power trajectory from 1969 to 2002, you see the most complete record of what 46 years of continuous pressure looks like. 330 gross horsepower, down to 200, back toward 325, then gone. The pattern across these 12 cases is clear. High-volume manufacturers could absorb the same compliance costs that made small, specialized companies go under. The regulations did not care if a company sold 500,000 cars or only 5,000. The ledger certainly did. Every mandate was the same size, but the number of cars available to pay for it was very different. The engineers who built these machines were never defeated by the market. People still wanted the Pantera, the RX-7, and the Defender. That demand was real. What ended these cars was the cost of staying legal at the volumes the market could support. No car in this story was ever officially banned from being sold. Each one was made impossible to build, one mandate at a time, across 4.5 decades of compromise. Think back to the opening of this video. Behind every one of these 12 machines, there were real people who gave years of their working lives to get the details right. The combustion chamber geometry on the Cadillac 500, the mid-engine packaging on the Pantera, the rotary seals on the RX-7. These were not just technical decisions. They were the kind of obsessive, careful work that only happens when someone genuinely believes what they are building matters. And then the paperwork arrived. That feeling you carry, the one that says they do not build them like they used to, is not sentiment. It is not nostalgia distorting your memory. The evidence is sitting in the metal, in the archive test results, in the compliance filings, and in the power figures that dropped year after year. The forever car was real. It existed. And it was made impossible, one mandate at a time, by people who never drove it. Every car in this story lost something when the accountants took over from the engineers. Now click on the next video to see what happened when that same shift occurred inside the most disciplined engineering culture in the world. The Mercedes W124 was so obsessively overbuilt it made Lexus nervous, and 40-year-old examples still feel like the day they left the showroom. Then the penny counters arrived, and Mercedes replaced it with one of the most rust-prone, problem-filled cars they ever made. That is the next story on screen now.